Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in today. My name is Laura Chapa, and today I want to talk to you about how soil is the climate solution. I'm an adjunct faculty at Austin Community College. I teach Introduction to Environmental Science and Introduction to GIS. I also work full-time for Esri, which is a global leader in GIS and mapping software, and I work with state and local governments to help them get the most out of our technology so that they can meet their business challenges and their geospatial needs. So nowadays, we collect an immense amount of data. And by collecting that data, it allows us to understand the world we live in. It helps us make more informed decisions. And with that, we can make better choices, and hopefully for the environment and for people. So with this understanding, this technology allows us to have this better idea and this better understanding of the world that we live in. And I also want to note that technology is not always the solution to our problems. In fact, solving our food, our water, our health and climate crisis is as simple as the ground under your feet, the soil. So today, I'll be giving you a crash course on how soil is the climate solution. First, I want to tell you a little bit about where I came from and how I got here today, because I feel like all of our stories are really important to the message that we're sharing. I actually grew up in deep East Texas, near the border of Texas and Louisiana, in the piney woods, and spent most of my childhood playing outside. And I'm really grateful for that experience, getting to play in the pine forest and pastures, and spending most of my childhood on Lake Sam Rayburn. But I had to move out of the small town, and I ended up going to Texas State University and earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology. But I specifically studied plant science, or botany. I'm fascinated with how one plant can live its entire life cycle in a single location. It can get everything it needs in that single location, from the sun, the air, and the water and the soil. I think about how far humans go every day to get what we need or what we want. And with globalization, that's an even bigger impact on our planet, to the lengths that we'll go to get what we need and want. So plants live harmoniously with their environment, which I think is so admirable. And I often wonder if humans can live just as harmoniously with our planet and with the environment. And I hope by the end of this talk, you'll be able to answer that question. My first job out of college, I started working for the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State, and I was doing research on the Rio Grande watershed. If you didn't know, the Rio Grande is the 5th longest river in North America. It starts in the southern Rocky Mountains in southern Colorado from snowmelt, and it works its way all through New Mexico and along the border of Texas and Mexico, where it eventually ends up in the Gulf. But I want you to take note of the picture in the middle on the slide here of the ocean. That's the Gulf of Mexico. You can see slightly to the right how that's the Rio Grande River coming to meet the ocean. But it's not quite there because a sandbar has developed in between the two. So some years, the Rio Grande is so overused that by the time it makes it to the ocean, it doesn't quite get there. And that's a big environmental problem because it's very important in many respects for that fresh water to mix with the ocean. So it was at this job that I first started learning about environmental issues. And with my love for the environment and nature, it was really devastating for me to learn about the issues that we're experiencing in the world. And I didn't really have a clear solution of what we could do about it. It seemed like a huge burden of knowledge, to be honest. And once you know something, you just can't unknow that. And so I really found that I needed to learn more about these other disciplines that are associated with environmental issues, because environmental issues aren't just knowing the biology to come up with a solution. You have to know the economic impact, how it affects culture and religion and society. You have to understand the geography of those issues. You have to understand the chemistry, and with that, the biology. So I decided to go back to school and earn a Master of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies of Sustainability. That way, I could study several different subjects to be able to arm myself with interdisciplinary knowledge to come up with the best solutions to fight environmental problems. The biggest takeaway from my studies and professional work experience to this point in my life was realizing the truth about the environmental state of our planet and the destruction humans have caused to our Earth systems. So real quickly, let's do a refresher on Earth systems. There's the lithosphere, which is the rock and sediment that's found on our planet, mostly in the planet's upper mantle and the crust. There's the atmosphere, which consists of all the gases and the air that we breathe. There's the hydrosphere, so all of the water that's on our planet, whether that's in salty form, fresh, solid, liquid, or even in vapor. And then there's the biosphere, which is all living things on our planet. All of these systems are interconnected, and they each play a role in maintaining a balance. But when one of those systems becomes imbalanced, it can create a chain reaction to other systems, leading to an even deeper imbalance. So like many of us here in the US, we're sort of sheltered by the realities of climate change and the impacts that many others are experiencing around the world. We sort of live in this bubble that it's not as real to us as it is to many that are fleeing situations caused by climate change. So let's take a moment to make you aware of the state of our planet, if you already are, and I'll do a highlight of each one of these systems and the imbalances that humans have caused to those systems. I really want you to take a moment to open your mind and open your heart when I touch on these topics, because I do believe that it's with our empathy and love that we can help each other find a solution, and being aware of those problems, we can make this world a better place. As corny as it sounds, it's truly how I feel. So let's talk about the hydrosphere first. The hydrosphere, all of the water on our planet. For one, I want to point out is the pollution that we've caused to the hydrosphere, from discharging sewage into lakes and rivers and streams, or sometimes directly in bays and into the ocean. If you see this image to the right, this is an image of the Yamuna River, where there is so much sewage waste that's discharged into the river every day, industrial waste, chemical waste from manufacturing plants, and agricultural runoff. All of those contribute to this white foam you're seeing in this picture here on the right. All of those things cause an imbalance in that system. I also want to point out fish kills. So fish kills are happening all across our planet. It's not known to just one area. This is actually a picture that was taken here on the Texas Gulf Coast near Matagorda. And fish kills often occur because of a couple of things. One, it could be toxicity. Some pollutant has been put into the water, and it's at such a high toxic level that it's killing all the fish and the organisms in that water. The other possible explanation is eutrophication. So when we have excessive nutrient runoff from agricultural fields, for instance, that enter the waterways, that excessive nutrient can cause excessive algal growth and algal blooms even. And what that excessive algal growth does is it absorbs all the oxygen out of the water. And when all of that oxygen is gone out of the water, then it leaves organisms to suffocate and die if they're not able to escape. We can't talk about the hydrosphere without mentioning the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi River watershed is one of the major watersheds on our planet. It expands across a massive amount of North America, this huge water drainage. And that also happens to be where a lot of our agriculture is grown. So all of the nutrient runoff from those agricultural fields, from livestock or row crops, end up in the tributaries of the Mississippi River and ultimately in the Mississippi River, which ultimately end up in the ocean. And when they end up in the ocean, we have excessive nutrients dumped into the Gulf of Mexico, which causes that excessive algal growth and algal blooms, sucking up all that oxygen, leaving the waters dead and unable to bear any life. So if organisms are able to get out of there in time to survive, they have to leave the community that they know and move to a nearby marine community, and then they have to compete for resources there. So this dead zone is growing year after year after year, and expands from Florida all the way almost to the tip of Texas. Another issue when we talk about the imbalance in the hydrosphere, and this is a big one, is sea level rise. So we know that our global surface temperatures are rising. We know that ocean temperatures are rising. And with that leads glaciers to melt, and they're melting faster than we have a record of as of now. And with that comes a rising sea level. And what you're seeing here in this image is a picture of a river eroding in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is an area that is especially affected by climate change and these sea level rise. And they're working really hard to get their people into safe areas due to sea level rise. So in this image, I just want you to really put yourself in those people's shoes. Their homes are being washed away. And in fact, in this area, there was a study done that it is expected this area to flood each year from now on. Imagine if you were from there and that was your home. Or imagine if your family had been there for generations and now you're faced with two choices. You either deal with the flooding year after year, which I'm sure would be devastating and tragic, or you pack up and leave. And by packing up and leaving, that's what we call a climate refugee. So we have people around the world that are forced to leave their homes because of environmental imbalance and catastrophe. Floods, wildfires, that could also be caused by drought. Maybe the soil is dead, so they're no longer able to grow any food. Or maybe the landscape has been desertified and gone from a landscape of vegetation to an absolute desert. How would you feel? I know that it would be really hard for me to face that fact. And what's even harder, I feel like living in a developed country too, is that developing countries are facing these realities the hardest when it's the developed countries like our own that are causing the majority of the problem. I also want to mention the Gulf Coast Stream. So I thought this was a fun map to show. It's showing the space in between Africa and North America. So if you zoom in to the right of the picture, you can see the Gulf of Mexico, and where that pink bold line, these are ocean currents that we're looking at. So all of these squiggly lines in the ocean, those are ocean currents. And that bold line that's coming from the Gulf of Mexico and moving northeastward is that Gulf Stream. That Gulf Stream takes warm water up into the Atlantic. It also takes with it nutrients as well. And what we've been finding recently is that the Gulf Stream is actually getting warmer and it's slowing down, which is going to further cause more imbalance. So this warm water that should be moving up into the Atlantic to push that warm water up there is not moving as fast, so that heat is not moving out in the direction that it should be going. And instead, it's being released more locally. So that warm water fuels hurricanes. And hurricane activity has increased since the 1970s. We've seen a big uptick in hurricane activity. We'll never forget Hurricane Harvey of 2017. This is the city of Jackson underwater. There were many deaths and $125 billion in damage. You know, I had friends of friends in Hurricane Harvey that had to escape to their roof during the event because the flood waters rose so quickly, getting their babies and children on the roof. I just couldn't imagine being in those shoes. And I'm fortunate that I haven't had that experience, and I hope I never do. But I can't imagine how devastating that must have been to lose everything. And then this year in 2020, Hurricane Laura. You know, again, more damage. This was Hurricane Laura hit a part of the coast that had really never been hit by a hurricane as far as we know. And these are just a couple of storms I wanted to point out. There are many around the world that are causing major devastation. And we can only expect with climate change for major storms like this to increase in frequency. Also, the flooding in the Midwest of 2019, so just last year. Here we're looking at two maps of the same area. On the left-hand side, it's March 2018, and on the right-hand side, it's a year later, March 2019. This is the Omaha Council Bluffs metropolitan area. So what we're seeing is the normal meandering of the river to the left, and then on the right, the impacts of the flooding. Again, this is still the flooding in the Midwest. 14 million people were affected by this flooding event. Rivers set new records for their height. 1 million acres of farmland were flooded. There were farmers that didn't support climate change, but once this happened, they wanted action. Just take a moment and try to realize if that were your farm underwater. And the other side of flooding that I want to mention when it comes to the hydrosphere is the absence of water, which would be drought. And while we're looking at this picture of all this water, all of that fresh water ends up in the ocean. We can't talk about the hydrosphere without mentioning all of the plastic pollution in the oceans. So here we have a beach littered with plastic. Sea turtles are one of my favorite organisms on our planet. They'll see a plastic floating bag in the ocean and they'll think it's a jellyfish and eat it and either die of a clogged digestive system or suffocate. This is an image of a sperm whale that was found in Spain. It had 64 pounds of plastic in its stomach when it was found dead. But there's far more organisms in the ocean than just whales and turtles, right? And all of those crabs, fish, sharks, dolphins, and even birds that play a part of that, they're all consuming plastic at some degree, and sometimes fatal amounts. That's just unacceptable. We also need to mention coral bleaching. So coral reefs provide this haven of life and diversity in the ocean and maintaining that ecosystem balance in marine environments. Here we're looking at a picture of the same coral reef. One on the right is a picture of the bleaching of that coral. The coral has, on the left, it's alive and thriving, and on the right, it is dead and bleached. So what causes coral bleaching? Well, there could be a few reasons why coral bleaches and dies. One of those is ocean temperatures. So as ocean temperatures rise, the coral can't survive. And we know that ocean temperatures around the globe are increasing. Pollution can cause stress to coral and lead to coral bleaching. Extreme low tides can also cause stress to coral. And increased CO2 in the atmosphere leads to rising CO2 in the oceans, which then leads to an acidic ocean, thus causing more problems of coral dying and bleaching. So now let's talk about the atmosphere. So air pollution is definitely caused by natural phenomena, such as natural wildfires, volcanoes, and even dust storms. But humans have definitely found a way to contribute far more to air pollution than some of those natural phenomena. So what is air pollution exactly? Well, it's a mix of gases, solid particulates, and water vapor. And some of those pollutants will get into the atmosphere and they'll start reacting, creating new gases, and even leading to acid rain. So we've increased our emissions in our atmosphere. And from that, we've put pollutants in the air. That has led to a greenhouse effect and heat getting trapped within the atmosphere, leading to global warming. And while all of this is happening, and we continue to contribute emissions and contribute to global warming, we're destroying vegetation. So vegetation is the one thing that we have, or one of the things we have, that can really help take that carbon out of the atmosphere. And so while we're putting more emissions in the atmosphere, we're also destroying our forests, which I feel like is a double whammy in a negative direction. So we need to fix one of those. Lower the emissions, plant more trees. So I also want to mention air pollution is so bad in some areas like Beijing that they even have a new disease they call the Beijing cough because of air pollution there. It's respiratory disease, cancer, asthma, heart disease, stroke, and even 4.2 million premature deaths per year are attributed to air pollution. In 2014 alone, the U.S. spent $790 billion because of air pollution, and it was mostly due to people dying earlier than they should have due to being exposed to this particulate matter in the air. So just to sum it up here, we're poisoning the very air that we breathe. And on that topic of air pollution and how it affects us, let's talk about the biosphere next. So I want you to take a moment, all of the living things on our planet, and I want you to think about one animal or plant that maybe really speaks to you, something you really admire, something that maybe makes you happy on this, in this worldly environment we live in. And I could think of several. And I just want you to really take a moment and reflect about how special life is on this planet and how we should preserve it and take care of it. But instead, we're right now experiencing the 6th mass extinction on our planet. As far as we know, there's been about 5 mass extinctions that have occurred on planet Earth, and all of them have been caused by natural reasons. But right now, the 6th mass extinction that we're experiencing is solely attributed to humans. So here we're looking at a graph. On the left-hand side, that's the extinction rate over time. So this is looking at 1500 to more current times, like in the late 2000s. And what we're looking at is mammals, birds, vertebrae, reptiles, fish, and amphibians, and how their extinction rates continue to increase, especially since the Industrial Revolution. Today's extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times higher than the background rate, and it continues to rise. So why are species going extinct? Why are they becoming threatened and endangered? So there's a few reasons for this. Humans alter habitat or even just destroy it entirely. We have had a history of overhunting species or overharvesting natural resources. The pollution of our air, water, and our soil contributes to the loss of species. The introduction of non-native species into ecosystems that have never seen that species before can be thrown completely out of balance. And then also climate change. So every organism plays a role in its system, and we need to recognize that. And some organisms even play a role across several ecosystems, like migratory species, like the migratory monarch. We're wiping out species at a rate before we can really understand the role that they play in the bigger picture. So in the bottom left of this slide here, we're looking at a boat that's filled with shrimp and lobster and fish, and I think there's even a shark mixed in there. So this is a really poor way to go fishing, and you're basically scraping everything up, looking for maybe 1 or 2 species that you really want to go back and sell at the market, but instead you end up collecting non-targeted species that end up getting killed in the process. Or maybe the illegal trade of ivory. That's another great example of overharvesting. And the bottom right of this picture is actually a historical picture of a few folks that have been overharvesting mussels, freshwater mussels. And then in the top right, that's another image of marine overharvesting, so different species that are found in marine environments. And then in the top left, the overharvesting of our forests. So habitat destruction, habitat fragmentation. Every time we put in a road, that's creating a habitat fragmentation and dividing that habitat into smaller and smaller pieces. Habitat change also contributes to species lost. And now let's talk about the lithosphere, the last system I want to touch on. So the lithosphere is that rock and sediment in the Earth's upper crust. And that consists of the soil. But our soil is sick and it's broken. We've lost nutrients in the soil. We've lost the microorganisms that keep the soil alive. We've lost the diversity in the soil and the diversity above the soil. We've lost water from the soil. Because of these changes and these impacts to the soil, we've created compaction of the soil, which makes it really hard or impossible for water to filter through the soil, thus continuing to aid in the dryness of it. And then when we do get a lot of rain, it's not able to be absorbed and it just washes away, causing flooding and sedimentation. And when that rain comes down and takes with it the soil, which we're losing that topsoil with those rains and those weather events, it's also taking with those pieces of particle soil, but it's also taking nutrients with it. Those nutrients end up in the waterway, and that can lead to eutrophication if there's an excessive amount of nutrients, which leads to the loss of oxygen for those animals and plants living in the water. Pesticides. Pesticides also kill microorganisms that keep the soil alive. I mean, just what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to kill life, and that's exactly what they do. And even in the soil, which may be unintended, but that's what happens. So then the soil turns to dust. It's more easily able to be blown away with the wind and the rain. That can lead to drought. And then what do you do when you get to that point? Well, I guess you've got two choices. You can either try to figure out the problem and do the right thing and bring it back to life, or you could always pack up and leave. Desertification. So this is when a landscape that wasn't a desert before, say a grassland, is hit by some of these impacts of the imbalances of the ecosystem, and then they become a desert. So a lot of deserts now that we have weren't actually always a desert. They were probably a grassland at one point in time that turned into a desert. A third of the world's farmable land has been lost in 40 years because of desertification. 2/3 of the world is turning into desert. And by 2050, 1 billion people are estimated to be soil refugees. So let's take a minute and talk a little bit about the history of the soil and soil degradation. So humans have been tilling the ground approximately 10,000 years. Okay, and it's been found that maybe the plow was the most destructive tool, not the axe. So actually, Washington has been really concerned with farmers running out of soil because of poor farming practices. But there's things that we can do. We can become stewards of the land, we can restore the land, and actually sometimes if we really work with nature, restore it faster than nature could do itself, which I think is pretty incredible. And I want to mention this quote by Albert Einstein. We can't solve our problems with the same thinking that got us into them. But we kept doing it. So even though we've learned over thousands of years the impacts of tilling, for instance, we kept tilling. And even when we experienced the Dust Bowl, which it was a combination of poor farming techniques multiplied with a severe drought, guess what? We still kept tilling. So with these poor agricultural practices, we are now, if we were to look at a cross-section of soil, the very top portion of the soil is what we consider the topsoil. That's the part where plants grow and where we grow our crops, for instance. And it's extremely important to maintain that topsoil. And if anything, maybe grow more topsoil, not lose it. But right now, with the way things are, we're losing 4 tons of topsoil per acre per year. So to put that maybe in terms that you can think of, that's 4 truckloads of soil. So imagine you have an acre of land, maybe think of your whole yard, or maybe if you have a small yard, maybe your neighbor's yard combined with yours, and someone coming once a year to get 4 truckloads of your soil and taking it away. Okay, so trying to put it in terms you can relate to. It's estimated that we have 60 years left until the topsoil is gone on our planet. 60 years, so I had to think about that. I'll be 93 years old when this inevitable doomsday comes. My oldest child will be about 65, and it's possible I could have great-grandchildren being born into the world with no topsoil, and I just find that unacceptable. Erosion has washed away the soils, undermining the carrying capacity of this land for the human population. So what is a carrying capacity? So a carrying capacity is an ecological term. It's the number of members of a species that an environment can support. So the max member of species that an environment can support. So how many humans can the earth support? I don't have the answer to that. And if we're not already there, I imagine we will be soon. And one last, a couple of other points I wanted to make about the lithosphere before I start getting into the good stuff, is that between 74 and 300 million acres are burned by wildfires annually, which makes a big impact to the lithosphere balance and the atmospheric balance, as well as the water. And I know we've had a hard year here in 2020, but this is actually an image of the wildfires in California and Oregon of this year. We can't mention the lithosphere without mentioning the impacts of glyphosate. So maybe you're more familiar with glyphosate in the form of its more popular product called Roundup that we put on our lawns to kill weeds and grasses that we don't want to be there. Roundup contains this chemical called glyphosate, which has been known and linked to cancer. And what we're seeing in the map here, these darker brownish orange areas of this map, that's actually showing us the areas that glyphosate is used the most for agricultural purposes. So Roundup is designed to kill life. That is its goal, kill weeds and kill grass. But what also happens from that is it kills the life that's in the soil that keeps it alive. So I also want to point out, I don't have the boundary on here, but that also overlays pretty closely with the Mississippi River watershed, all of that area that is in the dark orange and brown. Okay, I know that was a lot of negativity, but we had to get that out of the way. Let's do a quick recap before we move into the good stuff. So global surface and ocean temperatures are rising. Carbon dioxide and methane levels are the highest they have been in several 100,000 years. Oceans are becoming more acidic and leading to coral bleaching. Emissions continue to be released at unprecedented rates. Vegetation is being removed, which is taking away carbon sinks. And just to mention what a carbon sink is an area that takes carbon out of the atmosphere and puts it into the soil. So that's good, especially when we have a problem of too much carbon in the atmosphere. So along those lines of vegetation being removed, habitats are being destroyed and changed. Animals and plants are being threatened, endangered, and becoming extinct. Our water, air, and soil continue to become polluted. And 2020 has really shown us that human health is just as weak as the rest of the Earth's systems. So what do we do about this colossal problem? We need to face that we've reached a time in our species' existence that we have poisoned the air, the water, and the soil, the very things that keep us alive. And maybe perhaps we've poisoned ourselves. And how much longer will the Earth be habitable before it's really not? I don't have the answer for that either. There have been many great civilizations before us that have failed because the environmental degradation and deterioration they've caused, the environment was not able to keep up with the growth of the human population, which led to total collapse. So what can we do about it? And what can you do about it? Well, I love this quote, and so we'll shift gears here and move into a more positive direction. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So I have to say a little bit about how I got interested in soil and learning more about how important it is for our future. Is that I had a really good friend of mine say, hey, I know someone that I think you would get along with really well, and you have a lot in common. And at the time, I was really into health and nutrition. And so I ended up meeting up with this new friend. I'm always willing to meet people that are on the same wavelength. And I remember we met at a cafe in Buda for lunch one day. And it was the second time we had met, but the first time we really got to know each other. And what I thought we were going to end up, she was also really interested in nutrition at the time, and I thought we'd spend our lunch talking about nutrition and health. But she was in the middle of taking this course from Kiss the Ground. And Kiss the Ground is a soil advocacy nonprofit organization based out of California. And they're all about teaching people about how soil, what's wrong with the soil and how we can fix it. And so at that time, at that moment in that cafe, it clicked for me. I'd been learning about these environmental issues at this point for several years, but no one had really given me a solution. And that really bothered me, because to take on the burden of knowledge of what is going on in the world, but not having a clear solution, can take you to a really dark place, and it's really depressing. And it will really eat you alive if you allow it to. But finally, I learned of a solution, a real solution that I can do something about each and every day. And before I get into this next part, I just want to throw in a metaphor that when we go to build a house, what's the first thing we do? We build the foundation of the home. And the home itself will only be as structurally sound as the foundation. So if the soil on our planet is imbalanced, the foundation, then how can we expect all of the other systems on it to also be in balance when the very foundation is not in a healthy or structurally sound way? Well, I'll give you, I'm definitely going to give you some tools here today of how we can make that better. So one thing, if you'll notice on the far left, we've got a bare ground field. And so this is where we are right now. This is what we would consider degenerative. We're taking topsoil away. We're taking nutrients away. We're taking water away. Carbon dioxide is being released from the soil into the atmosphere. We're creating more issues by this degenerative way of living. The next one in the middle is regenerative. So this is what we need to be doing. We need to be regenerating, and not just regenerating our soil and our ecosystems, but regenerating the air and the water, which they're all interconnected. I also think we need to be regenerating our economics, and even in some respects our society. And so even though I did study sustainability, I really found that as much as I value the sustainability movement and what they're doing and all the progress that the sustainability movement has made throughout the world, I feel like they kind of missed the mark, because we don't want to sustain where we are right now. What we need to do first is we need to regenerate where we are right now. And we need to grow healthier and better systems, which will end up being better food, healthier people, and a healthier planet. And then once we reach a point where we're happy and living more harmoniously with the environment, then we can sustain. So maybe it's just a matter of semantics to you, but I feel like the wording of it does make a difference. All right, so what is soil? Well, soil is largely comprised of sand, silt, and clay, about 45%, with a quarter of it being air and a quarter of it being water. And I always like to say that roots like air just as much as they like water, so don't overwater your indoor plants. And then there's about 5% of the soil that's actually organic matter. So if we were to take that 5% of organic matter and expand that out to see what that 5% is made of, it's actually made mostly of humus, which is this really stable form of organic matter. And it comes from microorganisms breaking down plant and animal substances. About 5% of that organic matter is actually the living root and living organisms in the soil. Less than 10% is actually dead organisms. And then about 25% is actively decomposing. So that's really what soil is. And what happens if SOM is soil organic matter? What happens if soil organic matter changes? So here we've got an image on the left of a soil that has been stripped of a lot of those nutrients and the life, the microorganisms that live in the soil. And it's been compacted. So, you could imagine just compacting that soil down. And what happens when soil experiences compaction is that it then turns into mostly silt, sand, and clay, with hardly any organic matter, with less air and less water. However, if we were to look at the picture on the right, this is an image of soil that has been aggregated, so soil that's been clumped together, if you will, and it's healthy. It's got a living microbiome in it. It's more evenly dispersed of sand, silt, and clay, air, water, and you have quite a bit more organic matter in the soil. This is Ray Archuleta. He's a big pioneer for the regenerative agriculture, and he worked for the NRCS for many years and has a lot of experience there. And the NRCS is a government entity that helps farmers conserve soil. And what's interesting to note, though, is that we didn't really understand how soil worked. It wasn't really until more recently, in the last decade or so, that we've really understand the complexity of soil and how we need to take care of it and keep it alive. So we talk a lot about carbon when it comes to climate change, and how carbon is the problem, and the emissions are the problem. But we need to maybe shift the focus a little bit. Carbon really is not the enemy. In fact, one thing that I find really neat about planet Earth is that we're all carbon-based life forms. So I'm made of carbon, you're made of carbon, our food's made of carbon, and a lot of our homes and our everyday life is based on carbon. Although, of course, we understand that too much carbon in the atmosphere causes problems. But I don't want us to always point that carbon is the enemy. That's not the case. So let's shift gears a little bit. Where does a tree come from? Try to think about that for a moment. Where does a tree come from? Would you believe me if I told you that it came from thin air? Because that's actually the case of what happens. And how do trees come from thin air? Photosynthesis. So through photosynthesis, the plants are actually taking in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, combining that with hydrogen and oxygen from water molecules, and then they create these liquid sugars or carbohydrates. So when they create the sugar, the plant will then send those sugars throughout the plant body to the places that it needs that energy. And one of those places is also the root. But let's focus a little bit on this really important part of this process, the stomata. So the stomata is the small microscopic pore on the leaves. And when it's time to photosynthesize, they know the drill, they open up, and they start taking in CO2. And so this is a depiction of CO2 molecules being sipped up by the stomatal pore. So once the CO2 goes in, photosynthesis occurs, the plant creates sugars, it moves those sugars throughout the plant body where it needs it, and the root being one of them. And then the root has created a mutualistic, symbiotic relationship with the microorganisms in the soil. So particularly pointed out bacteria in this image and fungi. The bacteria and the fungi will actually penetrate the root, where the root, the plant, and the microorganism will share information, and they'll exchange minerals and sugars. So the plant will give sugars to the microorganisms. In exchange, the microorganisms will give minerals from the soil to the plant. And this is a symbiotic relationship that has developed over millions of years. Okay, so maybe you're getting the picture about what soil is, how plants participate in this process to maintain soil health, and how the organisms that keep the soil alive work with the plants. But where does soil come from? Well, would you believe it if I told you that soil also comes from thin air? And this is really interesting because we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere through the plant body as it creates those sugars, shares them with the microorganisms ingest them and thus create soil. It's pretty incredible. But what happens when we have a soil that's bare and there's no vegetation in the soil to maintain that balance with the microbiome? Well, if we have a bare ground like we do on the left, we're going to see carbon being lost into going into the atmosphere. And then if we have vegetation like the image on the right, on that same soil, now we are going to get soil sequestration, carbon sequestration, where that carbon will be taken out of the atmosphere and pushed into the soil. We do lose some CO2 in the process, but overall we get a net carbon gain when we have vegetation on the land. So again, reiterating this big exchange that's occurring with the roots and the microorganisms in the soil, the exchange of sugars and minerals, and them working together. And that's also where the roots will get water. So one thing I learned studying botany is by spraying your plants with water, your plants are not actually absorbing water that way, not through the leaves anyway. You may be doing them a favor by cleaning them off if you imagine them as little solar panels and you're cleaning the solar panel so it can be at its highest functionality, but the plant is actually not absorbing that water that way. You have to water the soil and the roots, and that's where water will be picked up by the plant. One of these really amazing relationships plants have is with mycorrhizal fungi. So these mycorrhizal fungi will create this network and web in the soil. They'll penetrate the roots of plants and exchange these minerals and nutrients with the plants. And there's even some science supporting that they exchange information. So that way, if there's an herbivore on the surface that's maybe eating on the plant, there's some maybe idea that there's information being exchanged with the soil and the mycorrhizae. So one thing that's really interesting about mycorrhizae is that they have these hyphae. And if you can imagine, the hyphae are like these little root-like filaments that are coming off of the, growing off of the mycorrhizae. And those hyphae have, they produce glomalin, which is a glycoprotein. And what glomalin, why that's so important and why I'm talking about it, is that it's like chewing gum. It's really sticky. And that allows the soil to stick together. So I want you to imagine you have a piece of gum. You take it out of your mouth and you stretch it out in a really long string. And you throw it into a sandbox. What's going to happen to that piece of gum? Well, you probably won't see the gum anymore. It'll just be covered with sand. So that's what's happening on a micro scale in the soil. These hyphae that have this glomalin, sticky substance on it, are sticking to the silt, sand, and clay in the soil and aggregating them together. And when they ball up and aggregate together, you then get pockets of air so that water can also infiltrate through the soil. So here's an image of the same species of plant. And on the left-hand side, we have the plant that has no mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. But the plant on the right has been inoculated with mycorrhizal fungi. And look at that network of webbing. The root growth is more abundant, and that mycorrhizae is being able to provide more nutrients and more minerals to that plant, increasing plant growth. So again, this carbon glue is an aggregate that holds the soil together, like we're seeing in the image here. And again, this humus plays an important part. It's this non-living, finely divided organic matter that it comes from microorganisms breaking down animal and plant substances. All right, and when we're talking about agriculture, so what's the big difference between conventional and regenerative agriculture? Well, the main difference is the way that we approach the soil health. In regenerative agriculture, we're making sure that we're feeding the soil and keeping the soil alive because, again, that's going to be the foundation for the entire system. And conventional agriculture doesn't exactly work that way. So I'm going to go through a series of before, or not before and afters, but comparison pictures. Again, on the left-hand side, we have a bare soil. Rain comes down. It can't infiltrate because it's become compacted. So it sits on the surface or it washes away, which could lead to flood and sedimentation and loss of topsoil. Oxygen cannot be absorbed in that system. Carbon dioxide is actually released and pushed into the atmosphere. And nitrogen also cannot make it into that system. However, like the picture on the right, if we had a healthy soil that's covered by vegetation, you can see the microorganisms are alive and well, keeping the soil alive. Water can easily infiltrate through that soil. Carbon dioxide, instead of being released into the atmosphere, is now being sequestered and taken into the soil. Oxygen is able to go into the soil, and nitrogen, which nitrogen is extremely important for plant growth. We can't talk about soil health without talking about cows. And I do have to say that I used to even give cows a bad rap before I knew better. And I thought that they were contributing quite a bit to greenhouse gases, which is true to a certain extent, but maybe it's not the cow, and maybe more so the way that we allow them to be raised in these conditions. So on the left-hand side, we're looking at a picture of a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation. You'll notice there's nothing green there, so food is not grown there for those cows. Instead, food is grown somewhere else in a tilled field, and that tilled field that is causing the compaction of the soil, taking nutrients away, loss of topsoil, water can't infiltrate it, and then that food is grown and then moved somewhere else to go feed these cows. So maybe it's not the cow, but it's the how. So if we were able to, in a regenerative model, take these cows and do this herd grazing approach, where we take the cows and move them across the landscape, mimicking what natural herds used to do, like the bison. And we can move them across the landscape, but really control where they go and how long they stay. So if we had them grazing in an area for a couple of days, and then we move them, that way they have deposited all of their waste, which is nutrition for the soil and the plants. But then those cows probably won't revisit that area for another 6, 9, or 12 months, allowing that grass to fully recover from the stress of the grazing, but with the deposits that the cows left behind, it continues to just thrive and make a really healthy system. Tilling. So maybe it's not the tractor, but it's the till factor. So while tilling is still very commonly used, despite our knowledge of, our more recent knowledge of the detriments that it causes to the soil health, there are other machines that you can still purchase where there's no tilling. Instead, it just kind of helps cut the grass down and the vegetation down and just sort of laying it down so that you can get ready to plant your next crop. And that's something that's really important to note, is the earth hates to be uncovered and doesn't want to be bare. And it's going to try everything it can to cover itself. So why don't we give it a hand? I want to leave you with 5 major principles of how we can solve this soil problem, which will then lead to many beneficial results. One is least disturbance. So again, taking away this tilling and trying to disturb the soil as least as possible when it's time to grow, or even during grazing. So making sure that we're moving herds along instead of letting them overgraze in an area. The living root. So making sure that the earth is covered with living vegetation so that that root can work with the microorganisms. They keep each other alive. The earth is covered. We keep carbon dioxide in the soil. We keep water in the soil. And in fact, we're sequestering more carbon out of the atmosphere. That will maintain the soil health and keep it going. Soil armor. So again, making sure that we've got living roots in the soil, but also that the soil is covered. Animal integration. So just like every animal and plant has its place in an ecosystem, so do animals and plants on the farm. And this goes with the idea of permaculture, where everything plays a role, and you use all of the chickens and the cows and the pigs, and they all work together with the crops that you're growing to maintain a healthy agricultural system. And then increase biodiversity. So biodiversity in the soil, biodiversity above the soil with plants and the animals. And that why biodiversity is so important is that if we have more biodiversity, then we have a greater chance of resilience. So that way, when we are stressed with a drought or a flood or some sort of natural disaster along those lines, or disease, then those systems can handle it because they have the diversity to get past it. All right. So some more comparison pictures to really drive the message home. When we have bare soil, we have increased CO2 leaving the soil into the atmosphere and increased water leaving the soil into the atmosphere. However, when the soil is covered with cover crops, we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere into the soil and taking water with it and maintaining moisture. Tilling. When we till the land, carbon dioxide is lost from the soil, and water is also lost from the soil. When we don't till, again, we're taking carbon into the soil, and we're retaining that water and moisture. Chemicals. When we use synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides, that increases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, increases the loss of water from the soil, and also increases nitrogens into the atmosphere. But when we have no chemicals, we take carbon in and we retain moisture. Overgrazing. So when we allow livestock to continue feeding and never giving the land the ability to rest and recuperate. That leads to, again, more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more water loss from that system. However, if we use planned grazing, where we're using this herded grazing approach and moving this livestock across the landscape and allowing the grasslands to regenerate themselves and allowing them time to rest, we sequester carbon and we retain moisture. Again, CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operation, not only are we sending more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more water out of the soil, but we're also sending more methane. When we have planned grazing, again, taking carbon in and retaining moisture. An annual plant versus a perennial. So if we're growing an annual plant, hence the name, it's only grown once a year. So it's not going to be there year-round, which is going to lead to carbon being released and water being released in the atmosphere. However, if we have a perennial, which means it's going to be there year-round, again, we're sequestering carbon and retaining moisture. Windbreaks are also an important part. So as you can see the fields on the right, you have the fields, and then there's line of trees. Those are the windbreaks. Those trees are allowing the sort of slowing down of the wind so that it protects the fields. And not surprisingly, that takes carbon in and sequesters carbon and also retains moisture. Whereas the picture on the left, if we don't have those windbreaks, can lead to increased carbon and water in the atmosphere. So you don't have to just apply this to rural landscapes. You can apply this right in the city. A vacant lot does the exact same thing. That bare ground is going to release carbon and water into the atmosphere. So you could replace it with a regenerative city garden and instead take carbon and water into the soil. So can you actually grow more soil? So we're losing all this topsoil every year? Well, absolutely we can grow more soil. In fact, my soil friend that I made a couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to go out to a ranch in the hill country and see these folks that had a few hundred acres of ranch land out there. And they showed us this one particular field that they had, and they told us they wanted to learn how they could do better for their land and do what's best in a regenerative way. And so we saw this field they had that they told us initially it was just bare ground and rock with maybe some sparse grasses on it. But when we went to go look at it, they told us that several years ago they had just taken the cows off of it. So it was heavily overgrazed because they weren't managing the cattle herd appropriately and leaving just the bare rock, which is pretty common in the hill country. We'll see that bare rock exposed. So they took the cows off and they started collecting native grass seeds and planting them up there and just continuously threw more and more grass seeds out there. And by the time we went out there and saw it this past year, it was pretty amazing because I didn't see one rock. It was covered with tall grasses, and even when we took a shovel and went to an area and dug into the soil, there were several inches of dark, rich, black soil, just like you see in this image. It was truly amazing, and definitely proved the point that, yes, we can absolutely grow soil. All right, so microorganisms rule the world. This is also something we really need to recognize. And if we were to look at in our own human body, take the number of cells of human cells compared to the number of cells of bacteria, for instance, there are far more bacterial cells in our body than human cells. So if you wanted to go by number of cells, we're actually more bacteria than we are human. And that relates to the soil as well. If we have a healthy soil microbiome, we'll have healthy plants, healthy animals, healthy humans, and a healthy planet. All right, so I know that was a quick overview of how we can grow more soil and how we can fix the soil problem. But once we fix the soil and make it healthy again, what is that going to do for us? Well, it's going to do a lot of positive things. It can change the water cycles and bring them back into balance. Groundwater will recharge because now that water is able to infiltrate through the soil and get to the water table. It also leads to clean water. So plants do an amazing job, and healthy soil that's aggregated does an amazing job at cleaning the water. It also can help create drought resistance. With regenerative agriculture and repairing the soil and restoring the soil, we can actually produce plenty of food for everyone on our planet, chemical-free. We can change the nutrient content of our food by making it more nutrient dense, because if the soil is healthy, it'll have all of the components that it needs to make the plants healthy. And if the plants have all of the nutrients and minerals they need, then we will as well. And we can also combat and create a resistance towards pest and disease. Again, this is going back to that biodiversity, which is going to aid in resilience and dealing with those pests and disease. Where is the money? So maybe you're wondering, well, how is this profitable? Maybe you don't need as much machinery as you would in conventional agriculture, and that is definitely the case. But you can actually allow farmers to prosper even more. They can get higher yields and less inputs. And inputs would be those pesticides and fertilizers that you're having to add to the soil because the soil is lacking. But if you're doing the agriculture in a way that's regenerative, then you don't need all those inputs. They're already there. You can also stack enterprises. So with that diversity on the farm, you can have several different crops that you're growing. So you're not just having one big harvest a year, but you're harvesting all throughout the year, which I think is pretty amazing. And then you can also have those animals that play a role in that system that are also able to bring you a profit. But there's more. By repairing the soil and bringing it to health again, we can bring resilience to drought, fire, and flood. So with that compaction of the soil and the bare ground, there's no vegetation, and the soil does not have those air pockets for water to infiltrate. So when we do get a large amount of rain, it comes down and just washes off, causing, could be flash flooding, or leading to drought. But by fixing the soil, we can bring those systems back into balance and that water as well. And even if there is a large amount of rain, the soil will be able to absorb it, which would mitigate the issues of flash flooding. We can also restore ecosystems. We can restore ecosystem function and increase that biodiversity that's so important for resilience. And lastly, have less CO2 in our atmosphere, which is what we need, and sequester a huge amount of carbon. The soil has the capability to sequester the amount of carbon that we need to get out of the atmosphere to slow climate change and mitigate the greenhouse effect. All right, so what can you do about it? And what can you do about it today? And this is what I love about this solution, is that it's not something we need to wait for policymakers to make change. We don't have to wait to elect the right person into office. It actually starts with the choices that you make every single day. The foods that you put in your mouth, starting there. Every time that you go to eat a meal, you're making a choice of what you want to support, okay? Because when we talk about environmental issues, we focus so much on fossil fuels. And while, yes, that needs to be addressed and we need to move toward renewable energies, we often skip the biggest part of the puzzle, and that's agriculture. Agriculture contributes far more to climate change than fossil fuels. Not to downplay the issues of fossil fuels. That also needs to be addressed. But what's something you could do about those food choices you make every day? Well, eat less meat. That's one thing. I'm not saying you have to give it up entirely, but maybe cut it back pretty dramatically. That's one way to do it. And you might even notice that you might see some health benefits coming from eating less meat. And when I say meat, animal products, dairy and eggs as well. Be a more informed consumer. So this is huge. Vote with your dollars. Every time you go to purchase a product, you are putting your dollars into the power of that company. And you are continuing to support the company in whatever choices they're making. So if there's a company that you support and you believe in the morals and the things that they're doing for our planet and the people are right, then boycott them. And I mean boycott, like buy their products and support them so they can keep doing the great things that they're doing to give back. But if there's a product or a company that you don't want to support because of the things that they're doing to our planet, it's not moving us forward and progressing us in the direction we need to go, then boycott them. Don't buy their products, because what's going to happen is if we stop buying those products from companies that aren't making the right choices, they're going to be left with two choices. They either adapt to the changing consumer behavior or they go out of business. And I bet they'll probably adapt. Another thing is start growing your own food. It really doesn't take much to grow your own food at home. In fact, my very first garden was on my apartment balcony, and I just started with a bunch of potted plants, and it was really amazing. I never liked tomatoes until I started growing my own tomatoes, and I realized what tomatoes are really supposed to taste like. Another thing is voting. So I mentioned voting with your dollars and how important that is and how much power you have with every dollar you spend. But I can't help but to make a plug here for the election. Early elections are going on. You may have already voted, and election day is just a couple of weeks away and counting. So please get out there and make your voice be heard and make it count. It's probably one of the most American rights that we have is to get out and vote. And one thing to note here is that when we're talking about climate change and the Paris Climate Agreement with all these countries that came around the world to come up with a comprehensive plan to deal with climate change, that was really progressive and really great. We needed to do that as an entire world. But the current administration is not in support of the Paris Climate Agreement and is actively trying to pull us out of that. I know there's a lot of issues that we need to address in our country, but in my opinion, I feel like climate change should be at the top of the list. And pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement is not a good idea. And so getting back to things you can do, composting. It really doesn't take much to start composting. Just pick an area in your yard and start throwing your food scraps in it. Get to know your farmers. Go to your farmers market. Support your local communities, supported agriculture. In Austin, it's Austin has made it really easy to be able to get plugged into your local CSA so you can get fresh food grown locally delivered right to your door. And then always reduce, reuse, recycle. So I want to leave you with a note of positivity. I love this story. This is by John D. Liu. You can look him up, and he's got some great videos out there explaining more of the work he's done. This is the lowest plateau in China. The image on the left is 1994. This is just one small image of this entire landscape that was completely barren from overuse for hundreds of years. But China took action, and they got people to work, and they started restoring this ecosystem. And in 2009, the image on the right, you can see that entire plateau had been completely changed and covered with vegetation. Rivers started flowing again. Water was clean. And I can only imagine that the air was a lot cleaner as well. So here it is, my call to action to wrap up for y'all. Let's invest our dollars. Let's invest our energy, and let's invest our focus and get educated, stop the bad habits to help the environment, which will only help us. We need to realize that life is not stagnant. Life is constantly evolving and adapting and changing, and so do we need to evolve and adapt and change. Our life cycles are not meant to be stagnant. We are facing health issues. We're facing a pandemic right now. We're surrounded by a poison environment that is screaming for our attention and our help. So we have a choice. Do we make the right choice and regenerate our systems, and not just the air, soil, and the water, but those other systems, the economic systems, the societal systems, all of these parts that play a role in the bigger picture? We must demand better of ourselves. We must demand better of our communities, and we must demand better of our governments and corporations and companies. I just want to reiterate, you and I hold all the power, not the politicians, not the corporations, although I know that it can feel that way, but that's not the case. Because if we weren't buying the products from the companies, then they would, again, have to adapt or go out of business. So don't ever doubt for a second that we don't hold the power, because we absolutely do. So we, the people, will lead the change, but the choice is yours. We are in this together. Thank you so much for your time.